My stepmother died in 2018. Emma had been living in the house that I grew up in since my father had died back in 2003. She was a wonderful woman, and she served often as a buffer between my father and I, for which I am extremely grateful. I remember as I was driving back home after the funeral that I was suddenly overwhelmed with grief, so much so that I had to stop the car. There on the side of the road, side of Route 15 north of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, I cried my heart out. As I got myself under control and started driving again, then I had this intense feeling of fear. It took me a while, like several weeks, before I finally realized where that was coming from. No matter where I had lived or what I had done, if I had succeeded or failed, I could always go home. But now, with Emma's death and the house going on the market, there was no home anymore. Fear. The fear of the unknown. Fear of what future may bring. I'm sure you have all experienced this fear at some point in your lives. It can cause us to do irrational things, to behave in ways that we never would have dreamed before. This gospel reading is just riddled with fearful characters. I think Herod is probably the most fearful of them all. Herod ruled by instilling fear into the hearts of those he ruled. He was ruthless, a powerful man who feared losing that power. To quote Yoda from Star Wars, "Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering." Like those who choose the path to the dark side in Star Wars movies, Herod's fear exploded into anger and hatred. He brought about the suffering of many, including himself. He was a man who murdered his own children so that they couldn't kill him first and claim his throne. We can all think of others like this throughout history. People from Hitler all the way to an abusive parent and spouse. The fear of losing perceived power leads to the suffering of oneself and others. Herod hears about this new king of the Jews that the wise men are searching for, so he calls for them to meet with him. He does this secretly. When I think of Herod's feelings for the wise men, I can only imagine hatred, contempt. How dare these men seek someone who would replace him? How dare they come to Jerusalem where Herod himself is sitting on the throne? The audacity. And yet he somehow contains his anger enough to try to deceive them into thinking that he would bow to this new king. "Go find him," he says, "and then let me know where he is so that I can go and bow to him." Nope, not gonna happen. Herod will seek to kill that child instead of being usurped by the child. The wise men, they have to be filled with fear as well. They have no idea what will happen to them on the roads that they're traveling. And yet, in spite of the risk, they set out from their homes to travel into Jerusalem. Now, the stars aren't out at night, so it's reasonable to assume that these men are traveling in the dark on very dangerous roads where bandits may be waiting for them. They get to Jerusalem and they get called in to chat with King Herod himself, whose reputation was widespread. Were their knees shaking when they approached him? These were smart men. They know that none of this is making sense. Stars don't move. They don't. How can they follow a star? It doesn't make sense for them to travel at night, but that's what they're doing. It makes no sense that they're looking for the King of the Jews. All they know is that a baby was born that was destined to become the King of the Jews. And that is what this story is all about. It's about God being so devoted to all people that he sends Christ to bring salvation to the world. God is so devoted to humanity that God guides these wise men to Bethlehem, these foreigners, to worship the King of the Jews. Somehow, through the birth of this child, God is bringing salvation to all humankind. King Herod didn't recognize what was happening. The chief priests and the scribes did not recognize the fulfillment of Scripture, but the foreigners, they did. They come to worship. And we don't know if these wise men become disciples or not. All we know is that they returned home. I like to think that they were changed by their experience and that they continued to look for Christ throughout their lives. Fear filled all of these people in the story. How they dealt with it is what makes all the difference. Where Herod let fear rule his life, the wise men were open to facing change in spite of that fear. They gave of their time and their wealth to set off on this journey that would lead them to the Christ child. Herod, he gave in to the dark side, to fear and anger and hatred. The wise men, they opened their hearts to the one who brings salvation to all people. So I have to ask the question, are we willing to face our fear of the unknown in service to Christ? The pandemic has left many of our churches greatly diminished in size and in fear of closure. That fear has led some to anger and hatred. And that same fear has led others to broaden their ideas of what constitutes church and how the church serves its community. King Herod let fear lead him to murder and terrorism. It brought only sadness in his life. The wise men, they faced their fear, and they followed where God led them, and they were blessed with joy and wonder and amazement. When we face our fear with the love of Christ, then we too have the opportunity of being a part of Christ's healing, his life, and his light in this world. And perhaps it will lead us to joy and wonder and amazement in all that God is doing for us.